By the time the second officer stepped in front of him, every conversation near the school entrance had gone silent. Parents waiting for the morning program watched as a black father holding a bouquet of fresh flowers was told he had no business being on campus. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply repeated that his daughter was expecting him inside. The more calmly he spoke, the more suspicious the officers seemed to become. Within minutes, children were whispering, teachers were watching from the doorway, and several phones had quietly begun recording. To almost everyone standing there, he looked like another stranger trying to enter school property. But the one person who recognized him was still inside the building, and when she finally appeared, the entire crowd discovered they had just humiliated the man responsible for giving that school a future. Before we continue, make sure you stay until the end, because every story has a moment where everything changes. If you enjoy powerful stories filled with unexpected twists, emotional lessons, and hidden truths, subscribe and join us for more. Now, let's go back to the beginning and uncover what really happened. Thursday mornings always felt different at Brookside Academy. Instead of the usual rush of buses and hurried drop-offs, the campus buzzed with parents carrying coffee cups, grandparents balancing homemade desserts, and younger siblings trying to keep pace with excited students. Colorful banners stretched across the courtyard announcing Family Achievement Day, while volunteers directed visitors toward classrooms where months of student projects were waiting to be unveiled. Kwame Mensah parked beneath an old oak tree across the street and took a moment before stepping out of his truck. Resting on the passenger seat was a bouquet of yellow lilies wrapped in brown paper. They weren't expensive, but he knew they would make Amma smile. Ever since she was little, she'd insisted yellow was the happiest color in the world. He had never forgotten. He checked the time, straightened the collar of his navy jacket, and picked up the flowers. His phone vibrated just as he reached the sidewalk. "Dad, please don't miss my presentation. I've been practicing all week." Red heart. A laugh escaped him. As if I'd let that happen. He slipped the phone into his pocket and started toward the front entrance. At 48, Kwame had the steady walk of someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities without complaining about them. His hands bore the roughness of physical work, and faint silver threaded through his close-cropped hair. People meeting him for the first time often noticed how little he spoke. Friends knew it wasn't shyness. He simply believed listening revealed far more than talking ever could. As he crossed the courtyard, the sounds around him blended into a familiar rhythm, children laughing near the playground, teachers greeting families by name, folding chairs scraping across the assembly hall floor, and music drifting through open windows. He slowed almost instinctively when the main building came into view. For several seconds, he simply looked at it. Not with pride. Not with ownership. With gratitude. Every classroom represented another child who would have opportunities that weren't always available when he was growing up. Watching families walk confidently through those doors reminded him that some investments could never be measured in money. A first-grade class hurried past, their teacher encouraging them to stay together. One little boy nearly bumped into Kwame before looking up nervously. "Sorry, mister." Kwame smiled and stepped aside. "No harm done. Have a wonderful day." The child grinned and ran after his classmates. Adjusting the bouquet in his hand, Kwame headed toward the entrance, already imagining Amma searching the crowd for him. He had almost reached the front doors when two uniformed figures stepped into his path, blocking the walkway without a word. "Good morning, sir. Hold on for a second." The voice wasn't hostile, but it was firm enough to stop Kwame in his tracks. A school resource officer approached from the entrance while a security guard casually shifted a portable barrier across the walkway, leaving only a narrow space between them. Kwame offered a polite smile. "Morning," The officer returned the greeting before asking, "Are you here for today's event?" "I am," Kwame replied. "My daughter is presenting this morning." "Her name?" "Amma Mensa. 7th grade." The officer tapped on the tablet in his hand, scrolling through the visitor registration list. After several seconds, he frowned. "I'm not finding your name." Kwame wasn't particularly surprised. "I probably forgot to complete the online registration. It slipped my mind this week. I can check in at the office if that's the procedure." Instead of nodding, the security guard studied him more carefully. "Do you have any visitor pass from previous events?" "No." "Any email confirming today's invitation?" Kwame shook his head. "My daughter reminded me. I didn't think I'd need anything else." The officer exchanged a quick glance with the guard. "I'm going to need some identification." Without hesitation, Kwame reached into his wallet and handed over his driver's license. The officer examined it, compared the photograph to the man standing before him, then returned it. "This confirms your identity," he said evenly. "It doesn't confirm you should be on campus." A couple walking toward the entrance slowed their pace. Another parent lingered near the welcome table, pretending to organize papers while quietly listening. Kwame noticed the growing audience but refused to let it change his tone. "I understand you're doing your job," he said. "If someone from the administration speaks with Amma or checks the student records, this will be cleared up in a minute. We'll decide the next step," the security guard replied. The choice of words caught Kwame off guard. He had expected caution. He hadn't expected suspicion. The guard folded his arms. "Until we verify why you're here, I'm asking you to remain outside the entrance." Kwame looked toward the building where children were disappearing into classrooms. "My daughter is expecting me." "So you've said?" The response landed with quiet finality. For the first time that morning, disappointment crossed Kwame's face, not because he had been delayed, but because he could already feel curious eyes settling on him. The officer lifted his radio to request assistance. Its sharp burst of static carried across the courtyard, turning a private misunderstanding into something everyone suddenly wanted to watch. Within a few minutes, the entrance no longer felt like the welcoming front of a neighborhood school. It felt like a stage. Parents waiting for the morning program stopped pretending not to look. Conversations faded into whispers as people tried to piece together what had happened. Some assumed the officers had intercepted someone dangerous. Others simply watched because uncertainty has a way of pulling a crowd together. Near the front steps, two teachers exchanged uneasy glances. "Do you know him?" one quietly asked. "I don't think so," the other replied. Neither moved. The school resource officer lowered his radio. "We're still waiting for confirmation." The security guard took another measured step toward Kwame. "Sir, until we receive that confirmation, you need to stay where you are." Kwame nodded slowly. "I've stayed exactly where you asked?" His answer wasn't defensive. It was simply true. The guard seemed unsettled by how calm he remained. Most people, after being questioned in front of dozens of strangers, would have shown frustration or raised their voices. Kwame did neither. He shifted the bouquet to his other hand, careful not to bend the stems. "They're for my daughter," he said almost absent-mindedly, noticing the officer glance toward the flowers. "I'd hate for them to wilt before she gets them." For a brief second, the officer's expression softened. Then training took over. "I'm sorry, sir. We still can't let you inside." A little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Why won't they let that man see his child?" Her mother hesitated. I don't know." Several people nearby lowered their eyes. The question was harder to ignore than the scene itself. Across the courtyard, Someone quietly began recording with a phone. Another person followed. Not because they expected the situation to become dramatic, but because something about the father's composure made the confrontation feel increasingly uncomfortable. Kwame noticed the cameras. He ignored them. His attention never drifted far from the school entrance. Every passing minute increased the chance that Amma would walk outside and find him standing there, surrounded by strangers. That thought bothered him far more than the questioning. The officer cleared his throat. "Sir, if this can't be resolved immediately, we'll have to escort you off school property." Silence spread across the courtyard. Even the children sensed something had changed. Kwame lowered his eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath before looking back up. "I came here to celebrate my daughter," he said quietly. "I never imagined she'd have to see her father treated like someone who didn't belong." The words lingered in the morning air. No accusation. No anger. Just an honest sentence that left several parents visibly uncomfortable. Before either officer could respond, the front doors swung open with surprising force. Principal Evelyn Carter stepped onto the landing, scanned the crowd for only a heartbeat, and then hurried straight toward Kwame with an expression that instantly erased every ounce of certainty the officers had been carrying. "Officer Reynolds." The principal's voice was calm, but it carried enough authority to cut through the silence gathering around the entrance. Every head turned. Principal Evelyn Carter descended the front steps without breaking stride. She barely acknowledged the crowd. Her attention was fixed entirely on Kwame. Relief spread across her face the moment she reached him. "Mr. Mensah," she said, extending both hands. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were being kept out here." Kwame offered a small smile. "It's all right." "No," she replied gently. "It isn't." The officer looked between them, visibly confused. "Principal Carter," he began. "We were only following protocol. His name wasn't on the visitor registration and—" She raised a hand, stopping him before he could continue. "I understand why you questioned someone you didn't recognize." Her eyes moved across the gathering crowd. "But I need everyone here to understand something." Parents, teachers, and students stood perfectly still. This school almost never opened. A few puzzled expressions appeared. 9 years ago, the district announced plans to build a new school in this community. Families celebrated the news. Then construction stalled. Funding disappeared, and the project was weeks away from being cancelled. She glanced toward the brick building behind her. Many people worked hard to save it. One person gave more than anyone else. She turned back toward Kwame. "Mr. Mensah." The name seemed to hang in the air. "He donated the land this campus stands on." A ripple of disbelief spread through the crowd. Principal Carter continued before anyone could interrupt. "When the remaining budget still wasn't enough, he quietly contributed much of his personal savings so construction could continue." Several teachers looked at one another in stunned silence. "But the part that has always stayed with me wasn't the donation." She smiled faintly. "It was his condition." The courtyard had become so quiet that birds chirping in the nearby trees sounded unusually loud. "He asked the school board never to place his name on the building." She paused. "No statue. No plaque. No dedication ceremony. He told us that if children spent more time reading a donor's name than believing in their own future, we had missed the point." A parent slowly lowered the phone they had been using to record. Another covered her mouth. Principal Carter looked directly at the two officers. "So when you questioned whether he belonged here," she spoke without anger, "you questioned the belonging of the man whose generosity allowed this school to welcome its very first students." Neither officer could find a response. Then Principal Carter added one final piece of the story. And even that isn't everything Mr. Mensah has done. For years, Principal Carter continued, students facing financial hardship received help through an anonymous assistance fund. She looked at Kwame before continuing. School supplies, uniforms, field trips, emergency lunches. When families quietly needed help, someone quietly made sure it was there. She smiled. That someone was Mr. Mensah. The realization swept across the courtyard in waves. Several parents wiped tears from their eyes. Teachers who had worked at Brookside for years looked at Kwame with an entirely new understanding. The school resource officer slowly removed his cap. His voice was noticeably quieter than before. Mr. Mensah. He struggled to meet Kwame's eyes. I owe you an apology. He took a step forward. I believed I was protecting this school, but I never stopped long enough to truly listen to you. I'm sorry for how I spoke to you and for putting you through this in front of everyone. The security guard nodded immediately. I made the same mistake. I saw someone I didn't recognize and filled in the rest of the story myself. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The crowd waited to hear what Kwame would say. He glanced down at the bouquet still resting safely in his hands. Not a single flower had been damaged. When he finally looked back up, there was no bitterness in his expression. My father used to tell me, he said softly, that respect is tested most when it's offered to someone you know nothing about. The officers listened without interrupting. We can't always control people's first impression of us. A gentle smile crossed his face. But we can choose what happens after the truth comes to light. The words settled over the courtyard more powerfully than any lecture could have. Principal Carter turned toward the families gathered around them. I hope today becomes more than a misunderstanding we forget next week. She looked at her students. I hope it reminds every one of us that dignity begins the moment we stop assuming we already know another person's story. For the first time since the confrontation began, applause broke out. It wasn't loud. It wasn't celebratory. It was thoughtful. One by one, parents joined in. Teachers followed. Even the officers quietly clapped, not for the donations or the recognition, but for the humility of the man who had every reason to embarrass them and chose grace instead. Then, from somewhere inside the school, a familiar voice rang through the hallway. Dad! Kwame's face lit up immediately. At last, the moment he had come for had arrived. Amma hurried through the front doors the moment she spotted her father. Without caring who was watching, she threw her arms around him. I knew you'd come, she whispered. Kwame smiled, the tension finally leaving his face as he placed the bouquet in her hands. I promised you, didn't I? She admired the bright yellow lilies before slipping her hand into his, and together they walked toward the school entrance, not as strangers seeking permission, but as a father and daughter simply enjoying a day they had both looked forward to. The weeks that followed quietly reshaped Brookside Academy. Staff members reviewed visitor procedures, emphasizing that safety and courtesy should always exist side by side. Faculty meetings evolved into honest conversations about assumptions, unconscious bias, and the responsibility that comes with positions of authority. Students were encouraged to ask questions before drawing conclusions and to remember that every person they met carried a story they couldn't see at first glance. As for Kwame, very little changed. He never asked for his name to be added to the building. He never accepted special recognition. He returned to his ordinary routines, attending school events whenever Amma invited him and slipping into the audience like every other proud parent. To him, the greatest reward had never been public gratitude. It was watching children walk through doors that would remain open for generations. Thank you for spending these moments with us. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts below. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged before anyone took the time to know them? Your perspective might encourage someone else. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about courage, compassion, and the quiet people who change lives without seeking recognition, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.